Okay, we're back on. So we're talking Boxing Day Wrestling in Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens back in the good old days. I'm Jennifer McCreath. Today is Boxing Day 2022. And 34 years ago today, I was sitting in Maple Leaf Gardens watching a house show. And I just did a video on that show. Back then, my parents were divorced, so I'd spend Christmas every other year with each parent. So I was in Toronto for 88 and 90, and I was in Nova Scotia in 89 and 91, so I missed 2 out of the 4 Boxing Day shows at Maple Leaf Gardens. So we're going to review 1990's show, which I went to, and I do remember. I have some memories of these shows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 matches in Toronto, Boxing Day 1990. A matinee, and much like the 1988 schedule, the wrestlers, they would pre-record TV tapings that would air Saturday and Sunday afternoon, 1-hour shows, which featured mostly interviews and matches featuring the superstars versus enhancement talent, designed to hype up the live shows. Pay-per-view was just fairly new at the time, so the way they made their big bucks was to get you to watch on TV some of the matches to the point that you'd be really fired up to go out to these house shows. You go down to Maple Leaf Gardens and fork out some money, and you get to see these matches live in person. And that's what it was all about there. December 16th, they wrapped up and took a Christmas break. It came back on Boxing Day. This would, I guess, be the 3rd Boxing Day in a row that Toronto was on the slate. It looks like they ran 3 shows on Boxing Day 1990 with 3 separate rosters. Or was it 2? Let's see here. Okay, Springfield, Massachusetts, so that's probably the B show. It was a matinee. And Providence, Rhode Island. Yeah, that's the same group. So the A show only had to work once on Boxing Day, and it was a matinee in Toronto. Whew. Unlike the show I reviewed earlier that had 15,000, Boxing Day, matinee, Toronto, with Hulk Hogan, only drew 8,500. The magic had worn off. The Hulkamania sellout streak went from 84 to 88. And when they took the belt off Hogan, that was kind of the end of... Nobody cared about Hulkamania anymore. Randy Savage had a good year. Hogan came back and won the title in 89. And again, nobody really cared. Hogan dropped the belt to the Warrior, and still, I guess Hogan was filming another movie, and he had that angle with the earthquake where he got injured and had to take some time off, and then he would then come back and feud with the earthquake. There was a SummerSlam match, I think ended in a disqualification. There was a Survivor Series match that I can't even remember. It didn't. There's nothing that stands out from the 1990 Survivor Series, other than the so-called grand finale match of Survival. Hogan and Ultimate Warrior captained Survivor Series teams, and they would both be sole survivors, which meant they would move on to a second match at the end of the night. And they basically, it was the 2 of them and Tito Santana against 5 bad guys. And Hogan and Warrior just cleaned house. That's really all I remember. Hogan Earthquake, I don't remember much about that feud in the Survivor Series. I do remember Dino Bravo and the Ultimate Warrior were brought in. And that eventually led to the Ultimate Warrior and Hogan working as a team to fight these guys off. And of course, it would eventually lead to Hogan and Warrior fighting each other at WrestleMania 6. This was after that, though. My goodness. Hogan and Earthquake fought for like a year and a half then. I'm really confused here. It was 32 years ago. Tugboat. Yeah, everyone remembers Tugboat. Not as Tugboat, but as the Shock Master. Before he had that mishap, though, Hogan and Tugboat against Earthquake and Dino Bravo. There's your main event. The tag team match that nobody wanted to see. They'd been feuding for the whole year, I guess. But that's what we got, and I guess by then we were tired of it. Hogan and Tugboat defeated Earthquake and Dino Bravo when Hogan pinned Bravo. I think the match was rather short. That's kind of all I remember about it. It looks like that match went on last. A lot of times Hogan would not go on last. He would go on before the intermission so he could get out of there early. Well, let's go back. Let's back up to the beginning of the show. Dustin Rhodes, who is still wrestling. Yes. Not yet Goldust, still Dustin Rhodes, Dusty's son, playing a gimmick of being Dusty's young son, dressed like your typical Texas cowboy, defeated the Brooklyn Brawler. Steve Lombardi, that guy worked just about every house show you could imagine. He lost just about every match. He was usually the opening match. So you got to give Brawler / Lombardi some credit. The first match is important. It gets you into the show. It gets you interested and engaged. I think the match went about 8 or 9 minutes. It wasn't a TV squash. It was an actual good match. Dustin Rhodes, at that time, he would have been, 21 years old? 22 maybe? Unbelievable. Oh yes, the Big Boss Man wrestled Bobby the Brain Heenan. Wasn't really a match, but at that time, the Boss Man and Rick Rude were getting ready to have this massive program. And then something happened with Rude. I can't remember if it was a contract dispute or he was suddenly removed from the roster. And they had all these matches booked. And they had to come up with something else. So Bobby Heenan was the replacement. And Bobby would grab the microphone and try to talk the Boss Man out of beating him up. And there was a feud where Heenan was making rude remarks about the Boss Man's mom, calling her this big fat hick from Georgia or whatever. So the talking went on forever, and finally the Boss Man had enough, and he gave Heenan like 1 or 2 punches, and then that was the end of the match. Still, if you want to be able to say you saw Bobby Heenan technically wrestle a match, this was a place you could do that. I believe he had the ball and chain, and he would lift it up in the air, this big thing, and go boom, drop it on his chest. Very good. Bobby Heenan, amazing, even in his limited capacity as a wrestler at this stage of his career. Superfly Jimmy Snuka pinned Haku with a small package. See, even 2 years later, every match kind of mattered back in the 80s. 1990 is like, let's just throw 2 guys into a ring and have a match. The storytelling is so important. It gives value. Even the undercard. Why should I care if Superfly Snuka and Haku are having a match? I thought they were friends. Weren't they both faces a few years prior? Davey Boy Smith and the Warlord had an arm wrestling contest that ended in a no contest. Okay, we've seen it 100,000 times. 2 strong guys have this arm wrestling match, and during the middle of the arm wrestling match, one of them throws a punch, so there's no actual winner of the arm wrestling match. You have this big brawl, and one guy gets his ass kicked, and that sets up a match later on in the night. So everything was going as planned. You had this arm wrestling match, and it ended in a no contest. Of course, the Warlord was the heel, so he probably punched Davey right in the face. But guess what? They didn't actually have a match. That was it. I think we were all kind of stunned. We're like, you brought these guys all the way into Toronto to have an arm wrestling match and no actual wrestling match? There must have been an injury. There must have been some reason that they couldn't deliver a full match for this. So I do remember that, and I do remember being quite disappointed. The Barbarian defeated Saba Simba. Now we're getting into these really, really obscure gimmicks. The Barbarian had just finished his tag team with Warlord. They broke them up, and they gave them new gimmicks. And I don't think anyone took either of them too seriously, because the gimmicks were too kind of hokey-pokey, stupid. But then they bring Tony Atlas back and make him this Saba Simba thing, and that was just going nowhere. Atlas obviously did not want to do the gimmick. I just don't know what to say. I don't remember much about the match. Two big muscle guys. I'm surprised Barbarian would get the pin. I do remember the previous show, Saba Simba showed up and was given a forfeit win because the opponent allegedly was not there. So they paraded this guy out with his silly outfit, and he waved at the crowd and then left. So at least we got a match out of him. But yeah, I don't remember any of that match. Rowdy Roddy Piper. Now there's a guy you want to watch wrestle live. Defeated Intercontinental Champion Mr. Perfect by countout. Yes! So Perfect and Kerry Von Erich had an amazing run. They traded the Intercontinental title twice, and they took that match on the road. 2, 3, 4 shows in a row. The matches would take place, and it would end in either a countout or disqualification. So finally they had the rubber match where the referee would be Roddy Piper, and he'd make sure that there was no shenanigans, and there'd be a winner fair and square. And of course, somehow Piper, as referee, Mr. Perfect didn't take too kindly to that, and I guess at the previous house show, Kerry Von Erich defeated Mr. Perfect, and Mr. Perfect blamed Roddy Piper, the referee. So I guess now they have a match. Okay, great. Piper would never get himself pinned very often. So if you're going to see Piper on a match, whether it's on TV or at a house show, and the title's on the line, it's probably going to be a disqualification or a countout. That's exactly what we got here. Still, to see Piper wrestle after a few semi-retirements was pretty cool. That was not the first time I saw Piper wrestle, though. I'm pretty sure I had seen him. Yeah, I saw him at WrestleMania 6 earlier that year. I keep thinking the show was before WrestleMania, but it's actually after. Sergeant Slaughter defeated Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Yes, of course. This was the early stages of Sergeant Slaughter's Iraqi sympathizer gimmick. How did he end up in a feud with Duggan? I don't remember. But they feuded for a long time, and then Slaughter actually won the title off the Ultimate Warrior, and he continued to feud with Duggan. Slaughter would defend that title against Duggan many times thereafter. What's memorable about this show was Slaughter was coming to the ring, and this old lady, Lily, was so angry with Slaughter, she took off her shoe and started hitting him as he was walking by the aisle. Slaughter versus the old lady in the crowd was probably the best match on the whole night. But he had legitimate heat. People hated this guy. I guess we kind of knew wrestling was a work, but I guess back then it wasn't clear-cut. So there were some people that actually thought this was a legitimate situation here. So I do remember Slaughter years later giving interviews talking about getting death threats for doing this and all that. He was great at his job. Should he have been the guy to defeat the Ultimate Warrior to win the world title? Probably not. That match wasn't very good. And it wasn't even about Slaughter. It was a match used to set up Warrior against Randy Savage into a feud. And Slaughter was just sort of there. And of course, it was a chance to get the belt back to Hogan again. So Slaughter would beat Warrior for the title, but he would lose it to Hogan within a couple months later. But yeah, Slaughter and Duggan had a good feud there for a while, and that was probably the most talked about match on the show. Even more so than this Hogan Tugboat Earthquake Dino Bravo thing, because that feud had run its course. Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart defeated Demolition when Bret pinned Crush. That's right, so Axe of Demolition started to have some health problems, so they brought Crush into the team, so we had 3 Demolition guys. Which meant after their face run, Demolition was once again a heel team, and they would often win by cheating because you'd have 3 Demolition guys, 2 guys wrestling and the 3rd guy managing at ringside. The Hearts would beat Demolition for that tag team title. Ironically, a rematch of the '88 SummerSlam, Hearts and Demolition. They would fight again at 1990 SummerSlam. So the Hearts had just won this title, and 1990 Survivor Series. Bret and Jim. That was the year Bret and The Undertaker fought at the Survivor Series. Was Jim Neidhart even in that match? I don't even remember this. He got the tag team titles there. Maybe Demolition still had the belts then. My goodness, I honestly don't remember. Bret pinned Crush, so the Hearts had the titles, obviously, because if you're going to make a pinfall, again, it was Crush. Road Warriors had entered the fray, and everyone was excited to see Axe and Smash versus Hawk and Animal, but we never really got to see that on a grand scale. They did fight. I think it was 8 matches, all on house shows and dark matches. One was recorded for Coliseum Video. Remember them? But yeah, for the most part, Crush took Axe's place here. So yeah, that's what we got to see. Bret Hart pinning Crush. Okay, great. And again, we've already talked about the Hogan match. Yeah, nobody cared. Nobody really cared at all. Earthquake was popular for a while because he was a Canadian, the Canadian Earthquake. Of course, I love the way Earthquake entered the company. Allegedly, a fan in the crowd was brought in to take part in an angle involving Dino Bravo and the Ultimate Warrior. Of course, Earthquake turned out to attack the Warrior. And Hogan, why? I just don't understand this feud at this stage. Hogan and Tugboat feuded with Earthquake and Dino Bravo for a long, long time, to the point where there was no need for them to still be feuding. I guess they had nothing for Hogan to do in between WrestleManias. Yeah, disappointing. And perhaps even more disappointing when they went with Hogan as a champion again. Initially, they were going to have Tugboat turn on Hogan. I think that might be why they were still going with this. They were going to have Tugboat turn against Hulk Hogan, and Tugboat was going to be the Iraqi sympathizer. And then someone said, no, that's a bad idea. Let's bring Sergeant Slaughter in to do that. But yeah, I guess you had these matches booked. I assume at some point Tugboat would have turned on Hogan. So you'd have Tugboat, Earthquake, and Dino Bravo all turning on Hogan. I don't know where the Iraqi sympathizer piece would come into that, but kind of glad we didn't get to see any of all that, because it probably would have been even worse than what we got with Slaughter. But yeah, this was a declining stage. The WWF, the Hulkamania magic dust had worn out, and they were trying to figure out what they were going to do. They thought Ultimate Warrior was going to be the next big superstar. They gave him the title, and he wasn't selling out arenas, and I think they gave up on him a little too quick. I think it was a mistake the way that they used Warrior as the champion. 1990, just for fun, I believe the Warrior held that title for 9 months. He only appeared in Toronto once. Just doing a search on this. Again, I plugged it in the last video. The history of WWE.com will give you a list of all the house show matches that ever took place. Maple Leaf Gardens. So there were 10 shows. That's almost once a month. That, okay, once is a reference. Yeah, okay, Ultimate Warrior would win the title on April 1st. May 27th in Toronto. So your new champion's going to come in and headline a show in Toronto. And there were only 5,000 people there. Why? Because it wasn't a rematch with Hogan. That would have sold out the building. For some reason they said, why don't you work with Ravishing Rick Rude again, even though we'd already seen that match. The Intercontinental title feud went on for a year. Nobody wanted to see Warrior and Rude again. And that's probably why nobody showed up to this house show. Warrior pinned Rude with a shoulder block splash. Next show in Toronto was June 17th. And Warrior was not on that show. Main event, Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire versus Randy Savage and Sherry Martel. 3,000 tickets sold. Jake Roberts beat Bad News Brown. Rockers versus Orient Express. Barbarian versus Snuka. 3 jobber matches. No wonder nobody showed up. July 1990. 2,500 people. That's it. And again, no Warrior. No Hogan. Demolition versus Hearts. Tito Santana versus Mr. Perfect. Earthquake versus Jim Duggan. If you can call that a triple main event. So they're not even using the Warrior on these shows. August 19th, 1990. Warrior and Kerry Von Erich in a tag match against Mr. Perfect and Rick Rude. Does not say what the attendance was. Big Boss Man versus Ted DiBiase. I don't think I went to this show. September 1990, Earthquake beat the Big Boss Man in the main event. Perfect over Kerry Von Erich. Hearts versus Honky and Greg Valentine. Still no Warrior. Ah, here we go. Here's the match I do remember. October 1990, Warrior and the Road Warriors against Demolition in a 6-man. And that match sucked, by the way. I think I've already done a video on that. November matinee, 10,000, Earthquake versus Hogan in a single. Kerry Von Erich versus Perfect. Boss Man versus Barbarian. Bret Hart also versus the Barbarian. Matinee. Yeah, so they're going downhill. Of course, then the Boxing Day show. So Hogan, 2 consecutive shows at Maple Leaf Gardens, Hulk Hogan in the main event. The combined attendance is 18,000. Ultimate Warrior had the world title, and he only defended it once in Toronto against Rick Rude. Then he had this tag with the Road Warriors. So he was never really even given a chance to properly be... If you want people to buy into your new champion, you got to profile them. Some of these main events were just terrible. I didn't even go to most of these shows, and I don't even remember. Probably wouldn't have wanted to go see it. So WWF falling apart here. They would come back to Toronto Boxing Day in 91. I would miss that show. For the record, let's see here. Matinee 91. Savage and Duggan defeated Snake and Undertaker. Bret Hart beat the Mountie. Bossman beat Irwin Shyster. Beverly Brothers beat the Rockers. The Berserker beat Davey Boy. Kerry Von Erich beat Skinner. Chris Chavis, who would eventually turn into Tatanka, defeated Kato. Yeah, not much to see on that show. My goodness. So yeah, there you go. Boxing Day. Kind of fun going down memory lane and remembering these shows. And I haven't watched a lot of wrestling lately. It just isn't the same. But it's fun to remember watching and going to the shows. Remember being so excited, going to Maple Leaf Gardens to see that, and buying the program, buying us the souvenirs. They had these stuffed things you could buy, styrofoam 2x4s for Hacksaw Jim Duggan. I remember buying one of those. I must have bought 7 or 8 t-shirts. I had a Hogan shirt, I had a Warrior shirt, I had a Jake the Snake shirt, I had a Ric Flair shirt. Flair wouldn't come in till the next year. By then they weren't running Boxing Day shows, but 91 and 92 I saw Flair fight 3 times at Maple Leaf Gardens. And amazingly, another world champion would make a return in 92, Bob Backlund, whose best days were back in the 70s and early 80s, made this comeback at the ripe old age of, what, 45? Here I am now at 48, almost 49. He wasn't that old. But yeah, Bob Backlund, wrestling in Toronto. And I actually met him after the show. We were out there buying popcorn, and he happened to come out of the dressing room. And really cool to be up close and say hello to Bob Backlund back in the day. But yeah, he couldn't sell tickets then. Nobody cared. 93, 94, and then Maple Leaf Gardens and WWF went their separate ways. I think 95 was the last house show for WWF in Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens. They would move to the Sky Dome and the Exhibition Stadium for some shows in 96, 97, 98. Of course, the Air Canada Centre opened in 99. Anyway, there you go. Hope you enjoyed the review of Boxing Day 1990 at Maple Leaf Gardens. It's hard to believe how long ago that was. I'm Jennifer McCreath. Thanks for watching.